About 20 years ago, I read a book by an economist named Marilyn Waring called If Women Counted. It argued that gender mattered for economic policy, especially for economic development. For example, Waring pointed out that a great deal of the work women do, reproduction, housework, subsistence farming, child rearing, didn't register in economic terms as productive. So when this part of women's workload increased, economists didn't notice. If public services, such as hospital beds, were reduced, the financial savings to governments showed up on the economists' ledgers, but the extra unpaid work and burdens borne by women caring for the sick at home did not. Around the same time, other feminist economists criticized international aid programs that transferred money to the male heads of households rather than to women and children directly. In many cases, the men spent the money on cigarettes and alcohol, and not on the well-being of their families. Still others pointed to the fact that national statistics, looking at the lives of children, assumed that either children were at school or were working in the market economy. Boys and girls, mostly girls, removed from school and working in the home were not accounted for. In some countries, as many as 60% of the nation's children were missing from the statistics. In the developing world, ignoring gender meant that many of the effects of social policies aimed to promote growth were not being noticed, whether women's lives were becoming more burdened, whether children were being educated, or even whether they were being fed. We now know, because of the pioneering work of Waring and others, that it's a mistake to ignore gender if we want to understand the problems of securing economic development for all, and if we want to find our way towards solutions. But not that long ago, that would have been a sea change, that understanding. What would war look like if women counted? The focus on war has been on men, especially on men in uniform. But modern wars kill far more civilians than soldiers. Civilians constitute almost 90% of the casualties in some recent civil wars, and the costs of war are largely borne by women and children. They're now the majority of deaths, especially if we count not only deaths during war, but deaths in the aftermath of war, as the effects of war, displacement, disease, poverty, malnutrition, and weak rule of law, continue to wash so many people away. Last night, the first of Abigail Disney's series of 5 films about women, war, and peace was broadcast on PBS, I Came to Testify, which reminds us how recent it was that rape was recognized as an all too frequently used tactic of war. The film tells the story of 16 Bosnian women who stepped forward to take the witness stand in an international court of law about their own rapes and finally lay evidence before the world of the use of systematic rape as a tool of ethnic cleansing. What would war look like if women counted? With her series of 5 documentary films airing on PBS, Disney helps to shift the ground of our understanding of war just as profoundly as an earlier generation of feminist economists, social scientists, and activists shifted our understanding of economic development. Her films examine conflicts in Bosnia, Afghanistan, Liberia, and Colombia through the lens of the effects of war on the lives of women. Many scenes from the films are heartbreaking, but the story of women in war is not only that of a needed full accounting of the human costs of war, it's also a story of organization, heroism, and peace building. As many of you know, last week, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and Laymi Gabowi of Liberia and Tawakkol Karman of Yemen won the Nobel Peace Prize for, quote, their nonviolent struggle for the safety of women and for women's rights to full participation in peace-building work, close quote. If you're like me, you may wonder why you hadn't heard much about these women before. At least 2 of the women are featured in Disney's films. What Does War Look Like If Women Count? I'll let Abby talk about her films and the answers that they provide to that question and other questions. So, about Abby. She wears many hats. She's a scholar. She's a Stanford alumna who holds degrees from Yale and Columbia, where she has a PhD in English and wrote her dissertation on war novels. I read somewhere, and she confirmed with me in conversation, that she first picked up a camera at the age of 47, which isn't very long ago, and then be joined on the stage by Anne Firth Murray for a question and answer series. Anne is a consulting professor in the program in human biology, where she teaches courses on women's global health. She was also the founding president of the Global Fund for Women. Please join me in welcoming Abby Disney.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's actually such a delight to be back in Palo Alto, where the weather is nice and the sun is shining and people are actually occasionally nice to each other. As different as they seem from high up above, when you get down to the earth and you really listen to the women, they really sound pretty much the same from place to place to place. And that was one of the motivations behind making this series, because when you talk to combatants about war, they really do describe quite a complicated thing. They describe landscape and ethnic tensions and history and the complexities of the hardware and the software and the mountains and the ocean. They describe snowflakes. They're all different. They're all complicated. Who can think about them? Who can solve this problem? But you know, when you talk to women about war, no matter where they are, no matter what their background, no matter their ethnicity or their language, they speak about one thing and one thing only, and it's fire, and it's metal, and it's terror, and it's running and starvation, and wondering where the next meal is coming from and whether your children will get an education. It is amazing how similar the vocabulary is from place to place to place. And you know, my grandmother used to use this expression about how the devil is in the details. And actually, I think of that expression as really useful here, but in an entirely different way than it originally was meant. I think the devil is in the details because the details are a lovely way to forget the nature of what it is you're really doing. It's a nice way to help yourself to sleep at night, rather than ponder the sort of choreographed brutality of what it is that war constitutes. So we wanted to take you into the world of women, and we wanted to really have a good long look at what they see when they experience combat. And what they see is very different from what you see when you turn on your televisions, in part because, well, they're there. They're not there when you turn on your televisions. We have really eradicated them from our landscapes. They're there on those landscapes as wives who say goodbye, and mothers, maybe. They're there as prostitutes. The word hooker actually comes from the name of a Civil War general. The camp followers were called hookers' ladies. And that's pretty much the extent of it. But of course, if you can conduct house-to-house fighting somewhere, surely the people didn't evaporate into thin air in those houses. Where did they go? Where are they living? What have they done with their lives? What's going on? Are they eating? Are they sleeping? On what? Where? Why? How? So we wanted to go and ask those questions. I think that the answers are kind of radical in an incredibly tiny way. I think that the shifting of that camera out of the hands of a Rambo, because the camera tends to go with Rambo wherever he goes, and into the hands of a woman is a small shift that has extraordinary, enormous consequences. And I think what happens is certain assumptions about the nature of combat and war fall away. First of all, you start to understand the difference between combat and war, because they are not one and the same thing. Combat is a subset of a much larger thing called war, and war takes place across an entire culture. It subsumes everything, from the economy to the healthcare system to the education to the lives of every single human being in it, to the governance, and it destroys everything in its path. So when we conflate combat with war, we get this infinitesimal picture of what in fact is happening and who the casualties really are.
One of my favorite phrases from Gandhi, or a counsel from Gandhi, is we should make injustice visible. And that is what you have done. And it's just amazing. And I really just want to start out by thanking you. I am so moved by what you've done. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. The question of why don't we ever learn and why doesn't the UN learn are maybe separate questions. Because the UN is a very particular kind of beast. And it really isn't structured for learning the way it currently is.
No.
It's just not. There's just a billion incredibly well-intended people there. Okay, billion is slightly high, but you know what I mean. But there are so many well-intended people there, but the structure is really radically bad. Mm-hmm. It just is, and so there's just a simple inability, I think, to incorporate change into the way that they operate. But I also think there's a piece of it that's really important, and that is that, you know, the reason that these rapes are happening on this scale in modern conflict is because the bad guys have done a gender analysis. They have sat around and had this discussion, and they've said, well, gosh, if we would like to clear the land of civilians and get them to leave in such a way that they will never, ever, ever come back, we should rape the women. And we shouldn't just rape the women, we should rape the most respected women and the youngest women, and we should rape them so spectacularly that everyone in every village for miles around will hear about it. So the spectacularness, the calculated sadism of these rapes has a great deal to do with some very fundamental things like controlling land, controlling resources, and keeping the conflict going. You know, Clausewitz famously said that war is politics by other means, but you know, actually we're in a different time now. It's economics by other means. And the people who are fighting these wars have no motivation to stop fighting. It's precisely the fighting that keeps the money flowing. And so they're not, you know, thinking in terms like Eisenhower would have been, to get into the village, kill as few as possible, lose as few as many, you know, and do it as quickly as possible. That's the way you fight a traditional war. That's not what's happening. I get into a village, I stir up a lot of problem, they leave the area, and my trafficking route is suddenly very clear, and I can start pulling the coltan out and bringing it through the Congo. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you go to Kivu is a great example of it. You could see it in Goma. There's an expanding concentric circle of brothels around every UN office, and it's not just the UN, it's every embassy, and it's every NGO. No matter how noble they may seem, there is an expanding concentric circle of brothels around every international agency in the world. So there is an internalized, you know, I think not entirely conscious resistance to these issues for precisely the reason that they're engaged in a form of sexual violence pretty much as an everyday matter anyway. And I know that sounds like I'm being melodramatic, but Lema and I went to DRC. We were in Goma. There's always a place like this. There's always a restaurant. You can get a good bottle of French wine and a really nice meal. Doesn't matter how badly people are living in Goma, you can always find a restaurant with a really good French meal. And all the white SUVs are parked outside. And in the middle of the night, Lema heard a ruckus outside of her room. She came outside, and there's a 16-year-old girl being shoved out of her room, stark naked, by a white middle-aged man. It made such a scene that all the other guests came to their doors, maybe 12 other white middle-aged men who watched this whole scene. Lema tried to get the hotel security to let the woman stay with her. She was no more than 16. She was hysterical and she was crying. Hotel security told her, no, 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 let us handle this. We get these women all the time. Oh, this happens all the time. And they waited till the police arrived, who basically beat her in front of Lema, carried her away and threw her in the trunk of their car. And that was the end of that. And the men all went back into their rooms, the doors shut, everything was fine. Everything was business as usual. It's so pervasive and not looked at and not discussed that I think it has an enormous amount to do with the the way that the idea bounces off of them and refuses to penetrate. So until they address the internalized sexual violence in their own ranks, I don't think they're ever going to really be. And how much weight do they carry when they go to a village to talk about sexual violence when, you know, the daughters of these people they're talking to can only scrape together enough to eat by having sex with these very men? I should also say that the work in the DRC was really interesting because the perception among the women that I met was that the story is being told plenty about the rapes, but the story of the women is not being told, the story of their lives and who they are and everything about them. And one of them said to me, I am so tired of you ladies coming here and asking me to repeat for you the worst possible story I can think of. And, you know, if I were shot in the arm, you wouldn't want the kind of details that you want if I've been raped. You know, and it is an extraordinary thing that we want to talk about this. There's almost a prurient quality to it. And in each of the 3 cities we went to, we asked 35 women leaders, spent 2 days in workshops with Clayman after seeing the film, for their 5 top priorities. And not one of those cities did they name sexual violence as their top priority. They named women's political participation. And why did they say that? They all said this was unanimous, because rape isn't the problem, it's a symptom of the problem. And so let's stop talking about rape and let's talk about women's political self-determination.
Just to note that it was that it was in fact not until the early 2000s, around 2002, that any statement came out of the United Nations at all about war having special effects on women. So it was very recent. I mean, this is...
Well, UN Security Council 1325 famously requires, I mean, not famously because most Americans don't know about it, but famously to me, requires that women be involved at all levels in peace discussion and post-conflict rebuilding. Well, you have to stop for 1 second and say to yourself, it's called UN Security Council 1325 because 1,324 resolutions before it were completely silent about women. Never said a word, never said the word woman or female before. This is the first Security Council resolution that ever speaks the issue of women. I mean, this probably also was happening in Liberia, but my experience of the women in the Congo was that they were, they had really been poorly served by the international community, which kind of has a way of, they sort of helicopter in and they kind of get all the women in a room and then they watch them as though it's an audition, you know. Oh, you really stand out. Let me take you to Geneva so you can talk to people in Geneva. So there's almost among the women a bit of a competition to seem heroic and noble and tell the best. And in some ways, that's the fruit of this is partly these really huge, ugly stories. But, you know, because there's a little competition to tell the story that will really pluck the heartstrings. So they're competing for donor money, they're competing for attention, they're competing for per diems. And it's almost like if you wanted to plan to divide women amongst themselves so that they were really incapacitated for organizing, you would treat it exactly the way you treat the DRC. So there are a lot of reasons why it's difficult to pull together that kind of movement in the DRC. But also, you have to remember that, you know, Liberia is the tip of the iceberg, and all these stories are the tip of the iceberg. And so you have to just assume, that's my way of operating now, is I just assume there's some women's movement I've never heard of in that country. Because women don't roll over. They just don't. And so they are organizing. They're just organizing as usual at their dog whistle level because none of the journalists are covering it or don't have the wherewithal to find it out, or aren't motivated to talk about it. And so what we found there were really great women who wanted to organize. So I think that the international community has to do a better job of not pitting them against each other, but rather giving them opportunities to gather and let them figure out how they want to handle this and then support what they want to do.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think when we began the Global Fund for Women, we thought our problem would be raising money, and then we thought, will there be will there be groups out there? Will they write to us? Because we weren't going to fly around looking for them. They were coming to us. They would find us. Would they be there? And I, for one, have been stunned over the many years at the unbelievable proliferation of women's groups, where there are a bunch of people here from the Global Fund who can describe this. I mean, organization after organization in the most unlikely places. Women are organizing, and there is leadership everywhere.
The whole question of war-related justice or war-related, you know, trials and finding the criminal and blaming is almost, it's, you know, the project is a little crazy because, you know, you're sent out onto a field to kill each other and to cause the maximal damage to the enemy. And then afterwards, the referee comes in and says, well, you know, but this was out of line. So it is a little, you know, I mean, and the people who wrote the Geneva Conventions were conscious of that. We're very aware of the fact that we need some referees and we need some basic boundaries, but we recognize that it's a little, it's faint. It's not powerful enough to push back on this powerful force. And one of the reasons we're seeing the kind of atrocities we're seeing is partly the participants in modern wars since the end of the Cold War are, for the most part, untrained, unversed in the Geneva Conventions. They're informal actors, they're non-state actors, they're proxies. And, you know, so there's no, why would they be motivated by the Geneva Conventions? In terms of gender justice, I mean, I sort of think that prosecuting rape isn't a question of having a gender lens as so much as having a human lens. I mean, yeah. And men get raped plenty in wartime. And boy, talk about a stigma. Those 16 women came forward, but in the last 10 years, a lot of men have come forward and talked about their rapes in Bosnia. And that's just as much about gender justice as anything else. But I think that, you know, it's just really important to remember that when Nuremberg was formed, there was a discussion about whether or not to prosecute rape. There was an enormous amount of rape that we still don't talk about against Jewish women during the Holocaust, against German women by the Soviets when they invaded. And there was a cable that went out from a French diplomat to his colleagues saying, well, we really can't prosecute rape because that would be too distasteful to talk about at Nuremberg. And you know, if you look, women in the if you look at the pictures and you look, you know, there are women stenographers, there are women bringing people coffee, and the men are making the decisions. And this is not to say men are bad or inherently tone deaf to this. I mean, I think it's like when I'm at home and we watch America's Funniest Home Videos, and invariably somebody hits a softball and hits a man in his private parts, and my husband and my two sons double over, and I don't. I think it's sort of similar to that. I don't think men feel that the way we feel that, which is precisely why women's voices have to rise in these places, because they need to push back on what feels normal to men, because sometimes what feels normal causes you to kind of gloss over or overlook things that are really, really important. So what changed between Nuremberg and Bosnia was, first of all, that women were willing to speak out about their rapes, which was different. There were feminist activists in Bosnia who were willing to be their advocates who had relationships outside of Bosnia, which they tapped into, and all of a sudden there were international feminists who were really giving their governments a hard time and demanding something be done. And then there were women prosecutors and women investigators and women magistrates. There's no way we weren't going to prosecute this time. And I think that's a genie you can't put back in the bottle, thankfully. Well, what happens to them is generally the same as what happens to them in relative peace in a lot of the world, which is they get shortchanged in education because they're not seen as important. And so when the rebuilding begins, the first thing that happens is there's a disarmament and demobilization and a reconciliation process. And usually there are young women soldiers who are so worried about being identified as former soldiers that they don't usually come forward. Or usually their arms are taken from them by their commanding officers or the people they're part of, and then they don't get compensated the way the other soldiers do, and they don't get reconciled in the way the other soldiers do. But in Liberia, which I know the best, there are just so few resources. It's really hard to comprehend just how poor that country is. And so while they're doing the best they can to build what they can build, I mean, they are so reliant on foreign money and foreign benevolence to build. There's a lot of energy in Liberia around building girls' schools. But the interesting unintended consequence of that is that the rape rates are rising. And there are men who will say the women are getting too good an idea of themselves because they have a woman president and they're building all these schools for girls. What about boys? And there are rape rates that are arising. So, I mean, I think this has to be about justice, you know, and it really has to be about justice in the long run, which means that everybody should get the education. We shouldn't lock the boys out any more than we should lock the girls out. And we need to make the effort to build the schools for everybody because, you know, yeah, you have your finger on it. Education is really the only thing that's going to dig everybody out. It really requires the international community not to lose interest the second the shooting stops, because that is precisely what happens again and again and again, is the minute the crisis is over, we take all those resources. There were people who told me in Liberia that actually they couldn't get health care after the war because Médecins Sans Frontières had left. And so that was all the health care in Liberia. And once they were gone, there was no health care. So we have to hang in there, and we have to be willing to stay for the... They say that it takes 7 years of development for every 1 year of conflict. And Liberia's conflict was 14 years long. So it takes a long time to build out from under that, and you need the international community to hang in there and provide security and education and all those kinds of things to reorganize society. I wish we had a whole hour to talk about women in uniform, because it's a really interesting, pressing issue. It's obviously a growing issue. And we kind of made this conscious choice that, you know, given that we only have 5 hours as against the 2,000, 3,000 years of the way it's been, and it's only been the last little squeaky tiny part of time where we've had women in uniform, it seemed only fair to kind of give that to somebody else or leave that for another day and really focus on what we have spent thousands of years ignoring. But nevertheless, the FETs are really interesting. What the FETs are, the Marines made this realization that they were just unable to talk to the women in the villages because the males can't interact with the women in the villages where things are really traditional. And so they put together female engagement teams of all female Marines who would go in, and they were allowed in to these places, and they could learn what was going on in the village, if there were weapons there, although that's a dicey thing because you put them in some trouble because then all of a sudden the Taliban knows who's talking. But also to provide health care and education and just generally blah, 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 hearts and minds. I have a very, I have mixed feelings about it because it's rooted in a recognition that we need to be thinking more about human security than national security, right? So it's not so much about securing borders and police departments, but making sure that the actual human beings in the place are safe and doing well. So I think that it's good news that our military is really coming to the realization they have to put some energy and some resources behind that. But at the end of the day, it's an occupation strategy. Anything that involves hearts and minds is an occupation strategy. It's just a euphemistic way of saying, you know, we're going to try and get them to be happy that we're here holding them at gunpoint and killing their relatives. So, you know, at the end of the day, I don't think any hearts and minds strategy is really going to get you very far in the long run, because an occupation's an occupation. When we started the Bosnia story, we were thinking that, you know, many of these children were reaching majority, and we were really interested in the question of, you know, how are they socializing? How are they fitting in? And what we realized was there was such an enormous amount of secrecy and shame around it that it was impossible to really say you had informed consent from an 18-year-old. You know, you really couldn't really say the person really knew what they were doing if they were outing themselves in that way. And so we kind of abandoned that storyline. But, you know, it's clear that their lives are really compromised by the circumstances of their conception. And there's, that was the intent. You know, that was what the Serbs, they very much said to themselves, well, you know, 18 years from now, you're going to have a half Serb living in your family. What's that going to be like? And it was a deliberate strategy to poison the well, and it's worked very well. I mean, Bosnia is not in great shape, and it stands very close to conflict today, because we all took our eye off the ball there. And you know, this is the thing about peace agreements. You know, you could do a peace agreement where a couple people in business suits, as they did in Dayton, arrived at a conclusion, generally all men. And what they did was they just pressed the pause button on the conflict. They didn't do anything to address reconciliation. They certainly completely ignored or in a substantive way, ignored bringing the justice issues to the national court system. In the national court system, in a country where there's 20,000 plus rapes, there have been 12 convictions for rape. So they have just not been serious about pursuing those things. And in many ways, the ethnicities are more divided than ever. So it's like a little hand grenade in the community. It's really sad. First of all, in terms of the UN and funding and its effectiveness, you know, I'm glad you gave me a chance to say something nice about the UN, because, I mean, it is easy to slam them, but, you know, Hillary Clinton said if they didn't exist, we'd be making them up right now. Yeah. We need them. They're sure. They're what we've got. So we need to fix the thing somehow. And you know what? I think the problems at the UN are primarily management problems. I mean, I think it's a ginormous bureaucracy, and the problems are primarily in the middle of the mid-level bureaucrats who are just looking to protect their positions. It needs a reorganization that's primarily managerial, and that will unlock a lot of capacity, I think, and effectiveness.
Do you think the recent combining
I
of
think
all the
that
works
UN
will
Women is incredibly good news, because there was a lot of territorial antipathy between the different organizations, which was, come on, guys.
Right, right.
And fighting over shreds and whatever. So I'm really happy, and I think Michelle Bachelet is the best leader you can ask for, but she's not being funded. They're always giving her money. It's ridiculous how little money they've all given her after the whole hoo-ha. I mean, it's really remarkable when we have this kind of constant pervasive sense that these organizations aren't effective, but they're never funded to get anywhere near the kind of capacity, you know, that you
right.
need to have.
Right.
So we're expecting women to get by on nickels and dimes, and it's not fair.
Tell me what most gives you hope as you look to the future.
I don't have a short answer to that. I'm apologizing before I start. There's this beautiful book called Blessed Unrest by Paul Hawken, and he talks about in the opening chapter this thing where he would just go from town to town to town and talk about environmentalism and activism. And invariably, people would come up to him afterwards and want to talk and give him their card. And he'd put the card in his pocket. And he talked about how he would come home and he'd put the cards on the kitchen table. And after, you know, a few months of this, he looked at this giant stack of cards. And he said to himself, wow, this is interesting, isn't it? And he talks about how, has there ever been a moment in human history where this many people have been this invested that they actually give up their earning potential and their sustenance professionally to caring for the environment or caring for people in other places? Has there ever been a moment in history with this much energy devoted to the well-being of people in a way that you couldn't possibly gain anything from? So that's what gives me hope. He pointed out that, you know, the Industrial Revolution wasn't called the Industrial Revolution at the time it was happening, because you don't know you're in a moment until after the moment is over and you look back at it and you realize. So it might behoove us all to stop and look around us and ask ourselves, are we at a different moment? And if so, what does it mean? And I suspect that it means something very, very good. And this movement he's describing is dominated by women. Yep. Women executive directors and women social workers and women who are peacemakers and peace builders. And they are really, it's interesting, as women, speaking as mothers, but actually asking for things that really benefit all of us. And I think that if we throw our weight behind this phenomenon, I think we look to really come out of these years with something altogether new.
I agree. And I honestly think that your films and what you're doing is quite revolutionary. I have hope in the number of people who turned up tonight and wanted to come tonight and in your films. And I want to thank you all for coming, and thank you again, especially.
Thank you.